Level 1. The Forging. Reveille sounds at 5 o'clock on a training world you did not choose, and the drill sergeant walking your barracks row already knows which of you will wash out before the season ends. You are 18, standing at attention in fatigues, still stiff from the quartermaster's stores, and the man 3 bunks down from you is already gone by the second week, reassigned to a labor battalion after failing the marksmanship bar twice. Nobody mourns him out loud. There is no time built into the schedule for that. Your regiment trains its infantry the way it has trained every generation before you, through repetition that stops being conscious effort and turns into plain reflex. You learn to strip a lasgun blind, to hold formation under a drill instructor firing live rounds a meter over your head, to teach you not to flinch, to march 20 kilometers with full kit and still be useful at the end of it. This is not cruelty for its own sake. A trooper who flinches at incoming fire gets the man beside him killed, and the regiment has buried enough sons of this world already to have stopped pretending the training could be gentler. Somewhere in the 6th week you learn the second lesson training is actually built to teach, which has nothing to do with weapons at all. A squadmate collapses during a night march. Heat sickness compounded by a pack loaded 20 kilos over regulation weight because he was too proud to report the strain earlier, and the instructors let the rest of you carry him the final 4 kilometers rather than calling a Medicaid transport. Nobody explains why at the time. You work it out later, lying in your bunk, with your shoulders still aching from his weight, that the regiment is teaching you what your own body will one day be worth to the man beside you, and what his will be worth to you. The final assessment comes in your 9th week, a live exercise against automated targets in collapsed ruins, built specifically to punish hesitation. You clear your section in 4 minutes, faster than half your cohort, and the sergeant grading you writes a single line on your file, steady under pressure. It is the only praise you receive during training, and it is enough, because steadiness is the quality this regiment values above almost anything else a recruit can offer. You graduate with your cohort 2 weeks later, sworn into a line infantry regiment as a trooper of the Astra Militarum, standing in a formation of 300 fresh soldiers on a parade ground built to hold 3,000, a detail nobody points out and everybody privately notices. Somewhere past the horizon, a war that has already outlasted several regiments is waiting to become the entire shape of your adult life. Level 2. First Blood. Your regiment ships out within the month, and the war zone waiting for you bears no resemblance to the collapsed practice ruins back home. Your first firefight happens on a rain-soaked agri-world contested by heretic militia dug into a grain silo complex, and the noise alone nearly undoes everything the training tried to build into you. Real last fire sounds nothing like the drone recordings. Real screaming does not stop when an instructor calls the exercise. Your sergeant, a veteran of 3 prior campaigns, keeps you alive in those first minutes through sheer repetition of the doctrine you half-learned back home. Cover, then fire, then move. Never all 3 at once, and never alone. You freeze for perhaps 2 seconds during the initial exchange, long enough that a round meant for you instead catches the trooper beside you in the shoulder, and something in that moment burns the doctrine into you far more permanently than any drill sergeant managed. You drag the wounded trooper back through mud to the Medicaid point yourself, applying a field, dressing your fingers somehow remember, despite the rest of you shaking too hard to think clearly. He survives. Your sergeant says nothing about the freeze afterward, which you understand eventually is its own kind of mercy, a veteran's way of letting a mistake exist without turning it into a mark against you. By the 4th engagement of the campaign, you no longer freeze. You have learned, the way every green trooper eventually learns or does not survive learning, that fear is not something training removes. It is something training teaches you to carry without it slowing your hands. The campaign ends after 14 weeks, with the silo complex cleared, and roughly a third of your original company either dead or invalided home. Command marks the world stabilized and moves the regiment on within the month, and you leave carrying the specific, unglamorous knowledge of what your own hands do under fire. Information no simulation back home could have given you honestly. Level 3. The Specialist. 6 months into your first campaign, the regiment's quartermaster reassigns weapons within your squad after losing a heavy bolter gunner to a sniper round, and your sergeant, having watched you handle equipment with more patience than most troopers bother with, hands the weapon to you along with 200 rounds and roughly 1 afternoon of instruction before your next engagement. The heavy bolter changes what you are to your squad. You stop being simply another rifleman in the line and become the weapon the whole fire team's tactics now organize around. The gun that has to suppress a strong point long enough for the others to maneuver. The piece of equipment that draws the enemy's attention specifically because it is the most dangerous thing in your section. You learn its temperament fast, because you have to. Which angles cause it to jam? How long a barrel can sustain fire before it needs to cool? The exact rhythm of controlled bursts that keeps ammunition from running dry at the worst possible moment. An assault on a fortified rockcrete bunker 3 months later tests everything you have learned about the weapon in a single afternoon. Your squad is pinned in open ground, and the only path forward runs through a firing slit your bolter can reach if you hold position in the open long enough to walk fire into it. You do, for nearly a full minute under return fire, until the slit goes quiet and your squad moves. Your sergeant recommends you afterward for a marksman's commendation, a ribbon and a note in your file that follows you to every posting after this one. Younger troopers start asking you, unprompted, how you keep the barrel from warping during sustained fire, and you find yourself explaining it the same patient way your own sergeant once explained doctrine to you, which surprises you the first time it happens and stops surprising you after the third or fourth. Within your company, you are known now as a heavy weapons specialist, the trooper trusted with the gun that decides whether an assault succeeds or stalls, a reputation built one engagement at a time. Level 4. The Armored Spearhead. Your regiment attaches to an armored column in your 3rd year of service. Mechanized infantry, riding Chimera transports alongside a line of Leman Russ tanks, and you learn an entirely different discipline, one built around protecting steel rather than simply advancing through open ground behind it. Tanks are blind in ways infantry are not, deaf to the small movements of a man, crawling close enough to plant a Melta charge against thin rear armor, and your job during the advance becomes watching the ground the tank crews cannot see. An ambush on the 3rd day of the offensive tests this directly. Heretic sappers emerge from a drainage culvert your column's scouts missed, moving toward the lead Russ, with charges meant to crack its engine deck, and you are the trooper closest to the threat when it breaks cover. You put 3 rounds into the lead saboteur before he reaches the tank, and the 2 behind him scatter under your bolter's suppression long enough for the rest of your squad to close the gap and finish the engagement. The tank commander climbs down afterward to shake your hand personally, a gesture that means little on paper and considerably more in the moment. One professional acknowledging another across a divide of rank and vehicle that rarely closes this way. You spend the rest of the offensive assigned specifically to that tank's escort detail, your squad's unofficial specialty becoming armor protection, a skill nobody back at basic training ever mentioned because nobody there imagined you would end up needing it. You finish the campaign having learned to read a battlefield the way a tank crew does, thinking in terms of engine decks and blind arcs and the specific vulnerable angles of vehicles worth more than your entire platoon combined. A second offensive the following year puts you back on escort duty for the same tank commander, who requests your squad by name this time, rather than accepting whichever infantry gets assigned by rotation. A small professional courtesy that stays with you longer than the campaign itself does. Level 5. The Ruins. The regiment redeploys to a hive world in its 5th year, contesting a spiraling arcology tower block by block against an enemy that knows the ruins better than any invading force ever could. Urban warfare unlearns half of what open field combat taught you. Range means nothing in a corridor 12 meters long. Cover changes shape between one step and the next as walls collapse under sustained fire, and an enemy can be 3 meters away, behind drywall thin enough to punch a hand through, close enough to hear breathing on the other side. You clear apartment blocks room by room for 6 straight weeks, learning a discipline built entirely around angles and silence, and the specific practice of not firing until you are certain what stands in a doorway. A trooper 2 floors below your section dies to a booby-trapped door on the 2nd week, a lesson the rest of the company absorbs without needing it repeated. You start checking every threshold twice after that, a habit that costs you time and saves, over the following month, at least 2 members of your own squad from the same fate. The tower's upper floors fall to your regiment in the campaign's 7th week, after a final push through a command level defended by the enemy's remaining hardened cadre, close quarters fighting at a range where a lasgun's length becomes almost a liability. You survive it because 6 weeks of room clearing rewired something in your instincts that the original training never touched. A read on a space before you enter it that has nothing to do with marksmanship and everything to do with attention. Command notes the tower's capture and dispatches, sent back to the sector's high command. A minor victory in a campaign most of the Imperium will never hear named. You spend the weeks afterward helping clear the rubble your own regiment made of the tower's lower levels, working alongside menial labor crews to pull bodies, both enemy and civilian, from collapsed stairwells that had once been someone's home before the fighting reached them. Level 6. The Long Watch. Your regiment draws garrison duty at a border fortress in its 8th year, holding a defensive line against raids that come without warning, across territory too vast for any single force to patrol completely. This is a different kind of war than anything before it, mostly waiting, punctuated by sudden violence that gives almost no notice before it arrives. You learn a patience the earlier campaigns never demanded, standing watch through nights that stretch past any reasonable definition of a shift, alert for a threat that might not come for weeks and might come in the next 10 minutes. A raid finally hits the eastern wall in your 4th month at the fortress. Heretic raiders moving through a supply tunnel nobody in the garrison knew existed, and the fortress nearly loses its main gate before your section, stationed nearby on routine patrol, catches the breach in time. You hold the tunnel mouth alone for almost 3 minutes before reinforcements arrive, a stretch of fighting in near-total darkness that tests reflexes built across 8 years rather than any single skill you could name. The fortress commander commends your section afterward, and privately tells your captain that men who can hold a line like that under those conditions are worth more to him than most of the officers currently on staff. The moment passes the way most moments like it do, in a regiment stretched thin across a dozen fronts at once, remembered clearly by the men who were there, and recorded nowhere else. You spend the remaining 2 years of the garrison posting training newer troopers in exactly this kind of patience, the specific discipline of staying alert through weeks of nothing, so that the something, when it finally arrives, does not catch you unprepared. Several of them struggle with it more than they struggled with anything in basic training, because a live-fire exercise has a clear beginning and end, and a garrison watch does not, and you find yourself repeating the same advice your own sergeant never quite put into words for you. That boredom held correctly is its own kind of readiness. Level 7. The Veteran's Burden. A new lieutenant joins your company in your 11th year, fresh from officer training on a Skola world, carrying rank that outranks yours by 2 full grades, and combat experience that amounts to simulations and lecture halls. He is not incompetent exactly, simply untested, and your captain quietly assigns you as his unofficial shadow during his first campaign, a role with no formal name attached to it. You spend that campaign teaching a superior officer things the Skola never covered, which ground actually holds a defensive position and which only looks like it does on a map, how long a supply line can actually stretch before it breaks under real conditions rather than theoretical ones. He listens, to his credit, and the campaign goes better for the listening. A push through contested territory in the campaign's 3rd week nearly collapses when the lieutenant orders an advance across ground you recognize, from 8 years of similar terrain, as a kill zone waiting to happen. You tell him so, directly, in front of the squad, a breach of protocol that could have gone badly for a trooper, speaking that plainly to an officer of his standing. He reroutes the advance. The alternative route costs an extra day and saves, by your captain's later estimate, at least a third of the company. The lieutenant thanks you privately afterward, a small exchange between 2 men who understand exactly what almost happened, and nothing more needs to be said about it. You spend the following years doing this quietly, again and again, for a rotation of officers who arrive green and leave, if they survive their postings, considerably less so. One of them, a captain by the time she moves on to a staff posting in the sector capital, writes you a personal letter after she leaves, thanking you plainly for keeping her alive long enough to learn her own job. You keep the letter. You become, over time, the institutional memory of your company, the thing new lieutenants are handed to keep them alive long enough to learn the job properly. A reputation that travels ahead of you to every new posting whether anyone writes it down or not. Level 8. The Last Campaign. 2 decades into your service, your hair has gone gray under a helmet you have replaced 4 times, And the regiment you graduated with has been rebuilt around you so many times that you are now, by a wide margin, the longest-serving trooper in your company. The one new recruits are pointed toward when they want to know what surviving this long actually looks like. Your final campaign takes your regiment back to ground uncomfortably similar to your very first deployment, another agri-world, another contested silo complex, and you find yourself explaining the same doctrine to a trooper barely older than you were that first night. Cover, then fire, then move. Never all three at once, and never alone. He freezes during the opening exchange, exactly the way you once did, and you cover the gap yourself without needing to think about the decision. The same way your own sergeant once covered for you a lifetime and 2 decades earlier. He survives the campaign. You take a wound in its final week, shrapnel through the knee that the field medicac can stabilize but never fully repair, and the injury is not fatal, only enough to end active frontline service after 22 years in uniform. There is no pension built into the regiment structure for a line trooper, no scheduled discharge with honors, because the Imperium does not budget for veterans the way it budgets for shells and lasgun packs, and a war this large has no calendar on which anyone simply stops fighting and goes home. The Medicaid board reviewing your file gives you 2 choices. Registration as a permanent invalid back on your homeworld, a designation that comes with barely enough ration credit to survive on, or resettlement as a colonist on one of the world's your own kind of regiment pacified further up the front, land cleared the hard way, and now needing hands to work it. You take the second option, because farmland, even farmland on a world you never asked to see, is still considerably more than the first choice offers. A handful of the troopers you trained walk you to the landing field the morning your transport lifts, an informal gesture nobody scheduled and nobody needed to. A few men standing on a landing pad who understand, better than any citation could explain it, exactly what you are leaving behind. You leave the regiment 3 decades older than the recruit who once stood at attention on that first morning of training, carrying nothing on paper beyond a service record and a knee that aches before every change in weather. What you actually carry cannot be written into any file. It is in the hands of every recruit you trained, every officer you kept alive long enough to learn the job, every squad that survived because you held ground nobody remembered to thank you for holding. The Imperium runs on soldiers who spend their whole careers exactly like this, campaign after campaign, world after world, until the body finally gives out and the war, indifferent as ever, simply moves on without them. If this kind of story is your thing, hit like and subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments which rank or role you want to see next.